saw there were numerous revolts in the course of the 5th century, but each one of them put down by the Athenians, often using the very ships that had been paid for by these allied states. Revolts were suppressed, and in fact quite often the Athenians then would seize the land of a territory that had gone into revolt, and it would be given over to Athenians, who were sent there not as colonists, not as people who left Athens and became members of a new society, but as clerics, Athenians transplanted onto another soil, but who retained their Athenian citizenship. So by the time that the war broke out in 431, Pericles could openly say what everyone knew. That is, that the Athenians possessed an arche, an empire, which embraced the entire Aegean. The Spartan sphere of influence was very differently organized. Sparta, as we've seen, was an isolationist country, a tribe or a people of the Greeks who tended to avoid involvement in affairs, particularly if those affairs took them away from their homeland of Laconia and the town of Sparta. Not only were they generally isolationist in their tendencies, but also the alliances that they had, particularly with the other states of the Peloponnese, were very loosely organized in the sense that these alliances did not involve a league in which all of the allies were subject to the will of Sparta. These Peloponnesian states, members of the Peloponnesian League, for example, did not pay tribute to Sparta. Rather, they made contributions to a general war chest which was used by the entire Peloponnesian League, a collective war fund, if you will. 451, Cimon returned to Athens. His period of exile was over, and almost immediately we find the Athenians signing a 5-year armistice with the Spartans. So again, we see these shifts in Athenian and Spartan policy in relation to each other being dictated by some of the major figures in Athenian politics. But immediately after this shift, this peace in 451 between Athens and Sparta, Cimon, who had once again raised the banner against Persia, took an Athenian fleet to Cyprus, where he was killed. And with his death, we see the end of this vigorous anti-Persian policy, and once again the pendulum in Athens swings back towards those who regard Sparta as the true enemy. You may have noticed that during the course of these lectures, at various times, we have come up against different concepts such as eris, strife. In the Hesiodic poems, as early as the 8th century, Hesiod tells us that there are 2 kinds of strife all over the broad earth, and he defines these as the good form of strife, which is the ambition that makes you emulate your neighbor and try to do as well and have as productive a farm as your neighbor. And the bad kind of strife on the other side is the spirit of competition that leads you through jealousy to go in at night and cut down your neighbor's vines. Now, this is a very key Greek concept, the notion of eris. Life is a continual struggle. We saw that in theatre, even in the stage scenes where 2 actors are facing each other, this is seen to be an agon, a conflict. When Hecuba and Helen in the Trojan Women address each other, it is as the protagonist and the antagonist, the one and her reverse, arguing with each other. And the athletic contests, which had done so much to give the Greeks the ethos, the aristocratic code by which they lived, was of course a code, an athletic and aristocratic code based on conflict, on competition. Life for the Greeks is a zero-sum game. If I do well, it's because you do badly. In the Platonic definitions that we have from the 4th century, one of the definitions of goodness that is offered is doing well by your friends and doing as much harm as possible to your enemies. This is the Greek conception of life. Now, we've seen this even in the politics of the Greek world from the Dark Ages on, when stasis, internal conflict, often almost to the point of civil war, was a continual state that led to the rise of tyrannies in various places, and we've also seen the effect that it had in Sparta in setting them off in a different direction. So conflict, competition, a rugby principle of life. If you see a head, kick it. This is found throughout every aspect of Greek life. The result in terms of warfare is that the states of the Greek world are virtually permanently at war with each other. Peace is the exception, not warfare. At any given time, any given Greek state is likely to be at war with one or other of its neighbors or some other group, not to mention, of course, being at war with itself in an internal civil war stasis. The alliance of Corcyra and Athens joined two of the three largest navies in the Greek world. And that fairly clearly must have been seen as a threat by other states whose interests lay on the sea and in seaborne trade. But even more important than merely the strength now of the Athenians allied to the Corcyrians was the question of location. The Athenian Empire that we've been talking about all through these lectures, as we saw, was an Aegean empire. It lay to the east of the mainland of Greece. Corcyra lies to the west of the mainland of Greece, and it lies on the trade routes that run up the western coast of Greece, across to the southern heel of Italy, and then on over into Sicily and the extraordinarily rich Greek colonies of Magna Graecia. From the point of view of Corinth, a trading power, the mother city of many of these colonies, and a city that had grown fabulously rich as a result of the trade to the west with the Greek colonies, the presence of an Athenian navy now in western waters must have looked very ominous indeed, as if a new sphere of influence were taking shape, with the Athenians moving from the Aegean and the east to the west. Possibly in retaliation for the events at Corcyra, the Athenians turned to a city within their own alliance, the city of Potidæa, and ordered it to dismantle its walls and to dismiss its magistrates. Now, the nub here was that while Potidæa was an Athenian ally located in the northern Aegean, it was a Corinthian colony. So the Athenians appear here to have been picking out a Corinthian colony as a way of getting back at them for the affairs in Corcyra and Epidamnus. The city of Potidæa was besieged in 432 by an Athenian force. The Corinthians dispatched an army of 1,600 of their hoplites, their heavily armed infantrymen, to help the Potidæans. But the Potidæans were defeated and the city was captured and its walls torn down in 430 BC. So in this period, after 433, we see a number of incidents in which the Corinthians and the Athenians are brushing up against each other in extremely hostile fashion. A decree barring the people of Megara from entering the Athenian marketplace or entering the ports of the Athenian Empire. Now, fairly clearly, this was an attempt on the part of the Athenians to compel the Megarians to become members of the Athenian Empire, the Delian League. Only once they began paying tribute as allies, it was understood, would they be allowed back into the port of Athens and into the rest of the Aegean. This is a trade war. It is an attempt to isolate and strangle the Megarians by, frankly, an embargo. The Megarian decree represents an attempt by the Athenians, I think, to create a trade zone that locks in the entire Aegean as well as the Saronic Gulf, the entire area immediately close to Athens. And from the point of view of the Corinthians, this must have seemed ominous, because if the Athenians could dictate this kind of policy, forcing a state to become a compulsory member that had otherwise no prior history of relationship with the Athenians, if the Athenians could do this, and if they now were doing it on the west of Greece as well as the east of Greece, as the affairs at Corcyra suggested, then the Corinthians were facing the prospect of losing dominance within their own sphere of influence, namely to the west of Greece. So it looks as if the development of Athenian power might very much have scared the Corinthians. What about the Spartans? I rather suspect that this was actually of little concern to them. The Spartans, as we've seen, were a land-oriented people. Their strength lay not with a navy, but with the army that fought on land. But of course, these events did threaten Corinth. And so it is that we see in the deliberations immediately before the war, Thucydides is probably quite right when he gives the Corinthian speeches in which they say to the Spartans, you have not acted vigorously enough to stop the Athenians. And the fact that you have been passive and that you have stood by and watched the growth of Athenian power has been detrimental to your allies. And you Spartans, by your passivity, have contributed to the war. It seems to me that we can probably paraphrase Thucydides to get to the true cause of the war. It was not the growth of power at Athens and the fear that it inspired in Sparta that was the truest cause of the war. It was the growth of Athenian power and the fear that it inspired in Corinth that was the truest cause of the war. Once the war broke out in 431, this period, this first 10-year period of the war, is normally named for the Spartan king who led the first invasion of Athens. His name is Archidamus, and so we refer to the first part of the war as the Archidamian War. During the Archidamian War, the Spartans invaded Athenian territory every year. Each summer, come March, just as you're getting ready to either plant your crops or to prepare the fields, in come the Spartans, and they cut everything down, making it impossible for the Athenians to grow any crops that year. And so each year, in the springtime, as the Spartans appeared on the horizon, the Athenians would pack their bags, collect their sheep and their other movable belongings, and they would move inside the walls of Athens. Remember that earlier the Athenians had completed their long walls so that the city was now a bastion, not only surrounded by walls, but connected by walls down to the Piraeus. They would come in, the Athenians would come in, and from the walls they would watch the Spartans devastating their territory. Now, this extraordinary policy is, in fact, directly attributable to Pericles. It is Pericles' defensive policy. And in one of his speeches, Pericles says to the Athenians, as long as you have the navy, you will be safe because you can supply yourself from your empire. In a sense, the Athenians are giving up their territory, Attica, and using the entire Delian League, the Athenian Empire, as their territory. So the whole scale of this war, and as a result the policy of the protagonists, is new. And the Spartans, I'm sure, in the first campaigning seasons, must have been astonished as they marched into Attica to find that there was nobody resisting them and that the Athenians had simply moved inside the walls. The Periclean policy that's outlined in his speeches early in the war maintains that not only should the Athenians rely on the empire and the navy to supply them, but at the same time they should not make the mistake of trying to make further additions to their empire. It's hard not to read this without thinking about the subsequent events in the war, because of course, the war will end in disaster for the Athenians for the simple reason that they did try to make additions, conquering Sicily. So in these speeches set early in the war, what we seem to have Thucydides doing is him trying to understand the underlying lessons of the war, the underlying reasons why Athens failed, and then retrojecting these back into his narrative early on, so that from the very beginning of the war we have a sense of the direction that it will follow as the war develops. This pattern of defensive warfare, though it lasted for many years during the war, was interrupted by important events in the second year, because it was in the second year of the war that Pericles died, and at the same time that the Athenians were hit by the plague. Now, these two events, I think, for Thucydides, were deeply affecting. They summed up for him something critical that the Athenians faced, something that the Athenians lost, so that in many respects the subsequent end of the war is really a long playing out of the conditions that we find early in the war at the time of the death of Pericles.